So the Tanakh is based on something called the Masoretic text, which is the Hebrew text of those books. Now there's another book, or a translation I should say, of the Tanakh called the Septuagint. Often it's just abbreviated as the LXX, okay, or that's the Roman numerals for 70, Septuagint meaning the 70. It is a 3rd century BC Greek translation of the Old Testament, or the Tanakh, the Masoretic text. It's highly influential and it's often quoted by many authors, Hebrew and Christian, New Testament authors, and so forth. So the Old Testament is simply the Christian name for the 39 books. And of course, the reason it's called the Old Testament is because of the New Testament. So Jews obviously reject the Old Testament name as somewhat pejorative, and they count the 22 or 24 books of the Tanakh. And though the content is relatively the same as the Old Testament, they reject that name. Now, regardless of what you're looking at, Septuagint, the Masoretic text, the Old Testament, the Torah always comes first, and that is for a reason. It's because the Torah is the first part of the whole Bible, and it's seen as foundational. So, the Hebrew Bible is a widely used name that's considered somewhat neutral, accepted by Old Testament scholars and Jewish scholars as well, albeit an imperfect name, because not all of the Tanakh, or what we call the Old Testament, was written in Hebrew. But Hebrew Bible is often the name you'll hear. I'll use all these terms interchangeably, Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, and Tanakh, to refer to the same functional canon, okay? So there are minor differences. So now let's talk about the Torah itself, the first 5 books. This is the law, and sometimes it's called the Pentateuch. Pentateuch is the Greek word for 5 scrolls, like Pentagon, Pentateuch, 5 scrolls. It's the first 5 books, and tradition holds that they were authored by Moses. Now, many Old Testament scholars, certainly not all, but many think that there's a 4-fold kind of editing process that went on. In other words, there were 4 major editorial stages. This theory is often called the documentary hypothesis, or the JEPD theory, pioneered by Graf and Wellhausen, 2 German scholars, Old Testament scholars. Now, like I said, the Torah is always comes first, and for a reason. It's because it is seen as really the foundation upon which the rest of the structure of the Old Testament is built. It includes Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now, the prophets, the Nevi'im, and the wisdom literature, the Ketuvim, they interpret and apply the Torah. So that's why it's considered to be the foundation. So Torah, the word basically means law or instructions, and is often referred to simply as the law, as in when you might read in other parts of Scripture when it says, in the law and the prophets, it's referring to the Torah. Another word that you will hear, not to confuse you anymore, but is often Chumash, which simply means in Hebrew, the 5 books, the 5 scrolls of the law. But more often than anything, you hear the word the Pentateuch, okay? So Pentateuch, Chumash, Torah, all of those words are really talking about the same 5 books. Now, the Nevi'im are the prophets, and there's a long list of prophets, and they're usually seen as interpreting the law, or applying the law to specific situations, or reminding the people of law, or calling them back to observe it, and so forth. The first prophets include Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Then you have the later prophets, sometimes called the major prophets of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Isaiah probably being the most memorable of those. Then you have the 12 minor prophets, and I won't run through all of those. In fact, sometimes they're simply considered as one book. But the Christian Old Testament divides them up into 12. Each has their own book. Probably the one that's most memorable amongst those minor prophets is the book of Jonah, because everybody's heard the story of Jonah being swallowed by a big fish and then spit up on the beach, and because he didn't want to take the message of God to the Ninevites. So those are the Nevi'im, the prophets. Next we have the Ketuvim, which are the writings, sometimes referred to as the Hagiographa. And these are the wisdom literature is another way of referring to it. This would include the Psalms and the Proverbs, the Book of Job. Those would probably be the three most well-known of the Ketuvim. But you also have books such as Daniel, which you might be thinking that he's a prophet, and sometimes he is grouped with prophets, depending on different traditions. And so, but sometimes he's placed with the Ketuvim as well. But this is also where we find the books of Ruth and Esther, just really memorable stories about some amazing women and the things that they did. So that's the three groups that we see in the Old Testament.